Hello everybody, it's I, Eternal Flame here, and today we're doing part 4, the finale of What If Yuji Awoke Shrine Early. Yes, this is going to be the final part. I want to say thank you to everyone who has been enjoying the series and who's been along with the journey, but let's get right back into the story of What If Yuji Awoke Shrine Early. Choso, Kusakabe, Leroux, and Miguel were all blown back by the amount of destruction that Yuji just caused with that Black Flash Dismantle combo, and Choso had a proud smile on his face for his little brother, but once the smoke cleared, Yuji nor Sukuna were no longer there, as they could see in the distance another black flash land on Sukuna, just as strong, if not stronger, than the previous one. As Kusakabe was starting to question just how far are these kids pushing themselves up to this point. This was also when Miguel and Leroux chose to leave, mainly because they had done enough by this point, with Kusakabe and Choso going in to back up Yuji. However, it's then we return to Yuji and Sukuna. Sukuna had been launched from a building, as he had to admit that strike to the soul did hurt a lot more than he was expecting. He realized in that moment Yuji had figured it out, how to use dismantle on the soul while using the soul punches at the same time. Furthermore, the punch was amplified by the Black Flash, as Sukuna had to question for a moment if Yuji intended to climb to the level of Sukuna. Unfortunately though for Sukuna, he didn't have much time to question or think about anything, as Yuji, with a terrifying focus in his eyes, hopped into the building right at Sukuna, moving at a blinding speed, Sukuna just barely managing to lift up his hands in order to block the punch that was coming at him, but blocking it was irrelevant as he was hit by another Black Flash with even more slashes, striking at the barrier between his and Megami's soul once again. As Sukuna was launched back by that strike, as burn marks formed on the ground while he was launched back, he could feel it. Megami's body was rejecting his soul now. He couldn't take more of those strikes, and he needed to get himself back on track, as he quickly launched out a wave of slashes at Yuji, trying to launch him away. However, in order to counter, Yuji lifted up his hands with slashes engulfing his hands, before he then did multiple waves of the hand, almost like he was slashing with a blade in a similar motion to that of Nanami, resulting in a wave of dismantles being launched out. The first of the slashes was enough to equal out the wave of slashes that Sukuna had launched out. That was how successful Yuji's dismantle had become by this point, as well as how much he had weakened Sukuna's output. All of that just from one slash, while a wave of slashes were still on the way to hit Sukuna. As Sukuna questioned for a moment if Yuji's slashes, even while being launched out, were actually capable of harming his soul or not, but he realized very quickly that he couldn't end up risking it. Even if they weren't, they would still end up doing damage to him either way, so he wouldn't want to risk getting hit by them. So he quickly slashed at the ground while jumping in order to launch himself out from the building that they were currently fighting in, but Sukuna realized too late that that was Yuji's plan, as Yuji was already on Sukuna's side before landing another Black Flash on Sukuna's side, punching him towards the wall. As Sukuna of course had to question if he was starting to become predictable or not, however he was able to stop himself from hitting the wall via doing a step on air, as he then quickly lifted up his hand and pushed it forward in order to launch out another wave of dismantle, while chanting as fast as he could to be able to get Scale of the Dragon and Twin Meteors out, which resulted in a slash cutting through a large chunk of the building that was coming at Yuji. Despite the fact that Sukuna had lost several of his hands and the fact that he had lost his stomach mouth and he had to use curse energy to make his heart beat, Sukuna was still able to fight to such an impressive degree, and a part of Yuji had to acknowledge that. And even though he was impressed at the combat level that Sukuna was at, it didn't hinder him one bit, as Yuji chose in that moment, instead of meeting the attack head on, he chose to launch himself out the building in order to dodge the massive dismantle that Sukuna had launched out at him. Before it was then, he landed on another building, and he took a page straight out of Sukuna's book, as he used a cleave spiderweb on the building as well as his own physical strength to launch himself off the building, moving with blinding speeds yet again thanks to everything that he had just used to amplify his own speed. As now, he was behind Sukuna, before punching him straight in the back, using another Black Flash infused with dismantle to launch him straight through the building, which that strike caused Sukuna to pant quite a bit, as it did quite a bit of damage especially to his soul, as he felt his fingers once again trying to exit his system, resulting in him vomiting up 5 of the fingers just for a moment before he consumed them quickly. He needed to do something before he lost, because as things were going right now, he was going to lose. He hadn't landed enough Black Flashes to get his domain to return to him. His RCT was only going down from here. He was already weakened and he only had 2 of his hands on his side right now, so he couldn't make hand signs. He needed to think on what there was for him to lose in exchange for binding vows. How could he win? But Yuji gave Sukuna no moment to think or strategize, as in that moment a wave of debris was launched out at Sukuna from up high. Yuji had used cleave on several pillars he had thrown at Sukuna as a way to distract him, while at the same time Yuji was rushing from him down below. as he released a wave of dismantles that was going for Sukuna as well. Sukuna decided quite fast what was more of a risk to get hit by, which was the dismantles themselves, so instead he launched himself towards the rubble, getting hit by a few of them as he landed right in front of Yuji, deciding to go for close quarters directly. Before it was then, Sukuna immediately went for a punch on Yuji and landed a black flash, allowing Sukuna to regain some of that fallen output. However, Yuji had caught the black flash, and while he was pushed back, he wasn't launched back, and he was clinging onto Sukuna's hand. Instead, in that moment, Yuji pulled Sukuna in to land another black flash right on the gut. Yuji was able to pick up the fact that Megami's soul was rejecting Sukuna, so he just needed to land enough black flashes and dismantles to win. Furthermore, Yuji could feel with each black flash he was growing in power and ability. All of his abilities were getting stronger, from his dismantle to his cleave to his blood manipulation, all the way down to the control of his curse energy. It would only be a matter of time until Sukuna was defeated. As Sukuna was launched back, he could feel the fingers almost come out of him, and he just barely held it down this time. But Yuji was not going to let him focus on that, as he quickly rushed at Sukuna while he was launched back and landed another black flash on Sukuna. Yuji was in the zone right now, and his target was Sukuna. He was going to make sure that Megami was free by the end of this no matter what. He wasn't going to stop until Sukuna was dead, and Sukuna could see that determination on Yuji's face, and it was a horrifying thing to see. However, while Sukuna was distracted and trying to hold down his fingers, Yuji quickly adapted by swapping curse techniques. He quickly swapped to blood manipulation as he manipulated some of his own blood from behind himself to explode and launch himself even faster as he swapped back to Shrine and punched Sukuna in the face with another black flash engulfed with dismantle, as Sukuna was launched straight through a building that was cut apart while being destroyed at the same time. If it wasn't for the fact that Sukuna had landed a black flash previously on Yuji, he would have fully thrown up a finger or several in that moment. However, Sukuna needed a moment to breathe, but he wasn't just going to let this brat take him down that easily. So what that Yuji had now landed 8 black flashes and figured out how to make Dismantle target his soul. None of that would matter because Sukuna knew he would win. As it was then, Sukuna attempted to use his chance to his advantage once again, by saying Scale of the Dragon Twin Meteors, as he had a feeling that Yuji had yet to figure out how to chant yet, while a wave of slashes were launched out at Yuji, all of them being amped by the chants. Thoughts were going through Sukuna's head in that moment. Yuji was one of the stronger opponents he had fought in a long while and was pushing him heavily, but he couldn't complement that to Yuji's strength. After all, if it wasn't for the fact that Sukuna was a vessel, he wouldn't have had this weakness. If Yuji had fought him back in the Heian era, he wouldn't have even gotten this close. But that was the simple reality of things, but even more than that, there was another reason why he couldn't accept the strength of Yuji. He couldn't accept that Yuji had gotten himself this strong because of the fact that if he did, it would completely invalidate who he was as a person. Yuji stood at the opposite of Sukuna, one who got strong on ideals against one that abandoned their ideals for the sake of power, one who saw being a human being as completely useless. This was why Sukuna was so determined to break Yuji, to prove that he was right and that his path of doing things were right. However, that was the difference between Yuji and Sukuna in that moment. Yuji could care less about this debate between himself and Sukuna that Sukuna has believed that is going on. He could care less about justifying their own life. His one goal was to get Megami back, and he was going to make sure he did. So instead of meeting the attack head on, he decided to jump out the way once again, in order to avoid the strike while he rushed at Sukuna to go in for another punch to try and land another black flash. However, this was exactly what Sukuna had wanted and was hoping Yuji would go for, because he read Yuji like a book, doing a similar move to what he had done before, as he casted the Flame Arrow. The Flames of Death roar forth. During this battle, Realm and Sukuna had hit Yuji with both Cleave and Dismantle. While normally he would have casted his Domain and waited until he could, he didn't have that choice right now. He needed to kill Yuji and fast, so he'd used his ultimate move. He could only aim his technique at one person, that one person being Yuji Itadori, because of a binding vow Sukuna had placed far before the time of this battle. Rather than it being a massive explosion of flame, it would simply be a fire arrow to burn away Yuji in a similar way to what he had done to Jogo. This was the move that Yuji couldn't use yet, as he had to wonder why. What was different between how Sukuna used it and how he used it? He had tried so many times to practice that technique, but he couldn't succeed. However, in that moment he needed to figure out a way around it. There wasn't enough time to dodge. There also wasn't enough time to activate Simple Domain in order to try and lessen the amount of damage that it was going to do to him. However, that was when Yuji had a flashback, back to when he had fought Choso, and Choso had hardened his blood heavily in order to block Yuji's strike. as he internally thanked his elder brother for showing him that trick, but he wasn't entirely sure if he could pull it off in that moment. However, in this moment it was all or nothing, because that was the only way he could take this technique and only take minor damage rather than taking the major amount of damage that he would take normally. As it was in that moment, blood rose out around Yuji's arm and hand that began to harden very heavily, before Yuji, with a cold and emotionless tone, said, "Blood meteorite is a technique that most blood manipulation users don't use. It is done by hardening the blood, something that is completely unnatural to most blood manipulation users, but they don't do this out of risk of suddenly developing thrombosis." However, this was a very intentional move, as Yuji had explained a part of the technique that he had just used, and by doing that, he had casted the Concealment Binding Vow, which resulted in Blood Meteorite amplifying its durability even more to clash with the already weakened Fire Arrow thanks to how weak Sukuna's output was. Now, Sukuna could have returned the favor by explaining how the Fire Arrow worked, by explaining the necessary conditions to activate the Fire Arrow, but he knew one thing. If he explained that might give Yuji access to the Fire Arrow, and he was already pretty sure the Fire Arrow was not going to kill Yuji, so he could not risk Yuji gaining access to that ability or else he would be a goner. However, thanks to Yuji's access to RCT, thrombosis being a risk didn't exist for him, as Yuji was pushed back by the potent power of the Fire Arrow. Even with that binding vow in mind, it was still incredibly powerful. Even though Yuji had weakened Sukuna's output so much, it was still incredibly powerful. This was the might of the King of Curses and his ultimate move. Heavens forbid what could happen if this was used inside of a domain expansion. But Yuji was starting to understand it now, that there was something more to Sukuna's Fire Arrow. After all, if Sukuna could use that Fire Arrow beforehand, he probably would have. There is something special about how to utilize it, and he just needed to figure out what. But unknown to Yuji, he was currently capable of using the Fire Arrow on Sukuna, as he had already filled out the requirements. He just needed to be aware of the fact that he could right now. As Sukuna could sense Yuji still alive in that wave of smoke, as he began to think on what his next move should be. As there were two sides of Sukuna currently. There was a side of Sukuna that was absolutely despising Yuji right now. The fact that Yuji could stay alive even after that annoyed and infuriated him. However, there was a part of him that was actually having a little bit of fun with this. There was a part of him that was a bit more intrigued, as Sukuna in that moment decided that he would stop holding back and that he was going to go all out. Now, he couldn't access his true full power, mainly because of the fact that his output had been weakened so much, but he could at least stop holding back and go to the full power of what he would be in this current state. As out from the smoke, they could see charred blood fall off of Yuji's arms. While Yuji had some burn wounds on his arms, they had finished healing, as Yuji was now staring down at Sukuna, the two of them getting ready as Sukuna released a wave of curse energy. Not as an attack, but as a declaration that he was going to stop holding back, and while the amount was equal to that of Yuta Akotsu in the current moment, it massively exceeded the power of Yuta Akotsu. The control and the output levels, despite the fact of how weakened it had become, was absolutely massive. Sukuna had made himself a beacon, as Urame was able to feel in the distance that Sukuna had stopped holding back. However, Yuji wasn't intimidated by this at all. No, he was going to continue forward no matter what, as Yuji and Sukuna both closed the distance with each other, and they clashed fists, neither of them landing a black flash in that moment. However, both of their hands were engulfed in slashes, and as a result of that, they were able to equal each other out. This was a little trick that Sukuna had decided to copy from Yuji now, in order to make it so those slashes wouldn't hit his soul directly. After all, if using his slashes worked to block the Soul Split Katana which was going for his soul, why wouldn't it work to block something that was going for the barrier in between his soul? As Yuji just realized that Sukuna was going to make this significantly harder for him. Yuji had not used his barrage of black flashes to his advantage. While he did put pressure on Sukuna, he gave Sukuna too much space. That would be a mistake that would not happen again, as the two of them began to repeatedly clash fists and block each other's blows. It looked like waves of sparks were filling the entire battlefield from the repeated amount of times their slashes collided with each other. Each time Sukuna attempted to land a blow on Yuji, Yuji was able to deflect it or block it properly. However, every single time Yuji had tried to land a blow, Sukuna had always managed to find a way to deflect it, whether through using slashes he launched out ahead of time, or through using his own hand-to-hand combat in order to deflect it with his mastery of the skill. However, while the both of them were in the zone, neither of them were actually able to land a black flash in that moment, as the both of them ended up pushing each other back from one of their strikes. However, after that clash, Sukuna lifted up his hand, launching out a wave of dismantles right at Yuji, as Yuji dodged and moved out of the way, but Sukuna was able to predict the direction that Yuji was going to go this time, and appeared right beside Yuji. Yuji was able to fully keep up with that speed and blitz attempt though, however he wasn't fast enough to move on time, as Sukuna placed a hand on Yuji's gut and used cleave on him right again. Now one of the steps to launch out the fire arrow had been completed once again. All he needed to do now was hit Yuji with another dismantle. Speaking of dismantle though, Yuji took advantage of this chance, as he engulfed his hand in dismantle once again before punching Sukuna straight in the face and launching him back, as he had landed another black flash. This black flash resulted in Sukuna being launched back, and while he was being launched back, he ended up throwing up a total of 6 of his fingers before he reconsumed those fingers. He could see that the amount of fingers he was losing would be greater and greater. It was only going to be a matter of time until all of those fingers were properly rejected from his body. However, that was when a total of 3 crows came down from the heavens out of nowhere, attempting to use Bird Strike in order to sacrifice their lives in order to hit Sukuna. However, Sukuna was quickly able to dismantle them using a wave of dismantles that he had launched at all 3 of the crows. But following that wave of dismantle was a wave of blood that had landed right on Sukuna. Before the blood then hardened on his body, as he could see Choso standing on a rooftop with his hands clapped, as Choso then fired out a piercing blood right at Sukuna. As Sukuna ended up giving that an unimpressed look, mainly because of the fact that Choso had already tried this before, so why would he try this again when he had already displayed the ability that he knew how to deal with it, as Sukuna then launched out a dismantle to tie out the piercing blood. However, he was able to notice that this piercing blood was even stronger and actually able to tie out the dismantle. Sukuna was starting to think, was it that Yuji had weakened him that much? No, Choso had placed a binding vow on that technique. As you could see both of Choso's arms fall off, he had sacrificed his arms in order to power up the technique massively, but it clearly wasn't worth it considering the fact that Sukuna's dismantles could still equal it out. However, it was then Maki rushed for his front, attempting to go for another Soul Split Katana slash, but Sukuna was confused at what their strategy was. Why was Maki going for such an obvious move? As Sukuna and Maki began their rematch once again. Now, while Maki wasn't fully recovered yet from the black flashes Sukuna had delivered to them, Sukuna was in a much weaker state, so the two of them were able to go quite even for a while, with the two of them slashing against each other repeatedly. As Sukuna was questioning why Maki went for this tactic. Why would Maki go for such a direct approach rather than trying to catch him off guard via stealth? However, that was when Maki told Sukuna that he was forgetting about somebody, as suddenly in a burst of speed, Yuji had appeared right behind Sukuna, and on Yuji's face were markings from Flowing Red Scale. Through the black flash, Yuji had been able to figure out how to use Flowing Red Scale, but he quickly deactivated the technique and swapped back to Shrine. Before it was done, the area got hotter and hotter, as in Yuji's hands a flame began to form. Not the orange and red flame that Sukuna wielded, no, in Yuji's hands was a blue flame. A calm and controlled flame with one target, that target being Sukuna. Through the black flash and having some time to think on what Sukuna was doing, he was able to figure out the conditions for activating the fire arrow. As in Yuji's hands now, a blue arrow made of flames had been formed, molded as if it was clay. As the method that Sukuna used to get over the problem of it being a ranged projectile that was slow using binding vows, Yuji had another fix, and that was quite simple, as he stabbed the fire arrow right into Sukuna's back. Maki and Choso had just served as distractions in order for Yuji to finish properly healing and figure out how to use this technique. And Yuji decided that he would stab the fire arrow into him like a spear, as Sukuna was launched up into the air as a result of that, with a total of 10 of his fingers being released from his body. While the blue flames engulfed his entire body as well as attacked the inside of his body as well. He could feel it all across his body, but there was something else he was noticing in that moment. It wasn't as strong as he was expecting it to be. It hit hard, but it definitely wasn't as strong as he expected it to be. However, he realized very quickly why, as another finger was rejected from his body, and another. Yuji had placed a binding vow on his arrow, where in exchange for 90% of the physical damage that would have been delivered to his body, that was delivered to the barrier between Sukuna and Megami's soul. And Yuji's flames weren't going to leave Sukuna's body until all those fingers were out, but that was the least of his problems. As suddenly Wee Wee had returned to the battlefield, and at the same time, he was bringing with him Hana Karesu, as the entire sky had been filled with light. Before a massive beam came down from the heavens to strike down on Sukuna, as the sky was filled with blue and yellow. It wouldn't be long until Sukuna's fingers had perished from this world, had been rejected from Megami's body, and burned away. Ryomen Sukuna was now dead. Killed and executed by the one he was careless in his attempt to execute them. as well as the one that he decided not to kill, believing that they couldn't do anything, as Maki then caught Megumi before they could hit the ground. At that same time, Urame had realized what had just happened. Sukuna had just been executed. Sukuna was now dead, as those words repeated in Urame's head again and again while they were battling against Hikari, as Hikari declared that he would be making Urame join them soon, which this would eventually lead into Urame's death. Whether it's a 1v1 between Hikari and Urame, or it's Yuta arriving in Gojo's body, or Maki Zenin themselves finishing them off, or even Yuji or everybody else coming to jump in, Urame is just going to die. And that is the end of this what if. Now, I do think it's pretty likely that Sukuna on death would have activated the merger. We just have no idea what the merger actually, or how the merger even works. So when we do find out how the merger works, I might make a bonus episode to this what if, but for now, just assume the merger doesn't happen, and it's basically the good happy timeline, where they end up honoring their fallen comrades in Higuruma and Gojo, with Yuta Akotsu returning back to his body, as several of the students continue on their work as Jujutsu sorcerers. Now, some of them do end up retiring, but most of them do continue their work as Jujutsu sorcerers, with several of them joining into Jujutsu High. Yuji in particular taking on a very similar role to that of Gojo, in order to help guide the next generation while being their protector, as he begins to master his abilities more and more, mastering the abilities of Sukuna and now being basically the exact opposite of what Sukuna was, where he helps people and helps them get stronger via using his abilities to help guide them. Now, of course, there is the issue of the world itself knowing about curse energy now, but I don't think that is too much of a threat considering how easily the military was dealt with, so I think that is eventually just going to be handled. How that could end up going is really hard to guess, because we have no idea how it's going to end up going in the actual JJK. So there are some interesting ways this could be written, but this is much more fanfiction-y and would require us to write an entirely new plot for JJK after the Battle of Sukuna. However, that might come in the future, who knows. But for now, that's going to be the end of this what if, of what if Yuji Itadori had awakened Shrine early. So thank you to everyone who had supported this series and everyone who has watched every single part, or even if you've just watched one part. It means a lot to me, and I'm really thankful for everybody who's come along with this entire journey, because this was a lot of fun to write. However, that's the end of this video. I hope you all have a good day. I'm gonna see you all later. Bye.